Three identical Korean triplets gave Ifoma exactly 60 minutes to sign a binding marriage contract and agree to belong to them all, or they would signal a hit squad already stationed outside her mother's home in Lagos, Nigeria. 1 hour to choose between the life she had worked so hard to build and a gilded cage shared by three dangerous men who made it clear that once she crossed their threshold, she would never be allowed to leave. The knock on Ifoma's door at midnight was not a request. It was an arrival. It was heavy, rhythmic, and carried the weight of an inevitable storm. She dropped her pen, the silence of her apartment suddenly feeling fragile as she moved toward the entryway. Through the peephole, her breath hitched. Standing in the dimly lit hallway were three men who looked like reflections of the same dark, polished mirror. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in charcoal luxury suits that screamed of wealth and whispered of blood. When she opened the door, the air in the room seemed to vanish. They stepped inside with a synchronized, disciplined grace that made her small living room feel like a trap. The brother in the center, Ji-hoon, looked at her with eyes as cold as a winter shoreline, while the one to his left, Ji-won, offered a smile that didn't reach his calculating gaze. The third, Ji-seok, remained by the door, a silent, brooding shadow. Ji-hoon spoke first, his voice a low, commanding baritone. He explained that her father's business dealings in Macau had incurred a debt that couldn't be paid in currency. Ifoma tried to argue, her voice trembling as she insisted she was just a woman trying to finish her degree. But Ji-won stepped forward, tapping a tablet screen to show a live, high-definition feed of her younger sisters sleeping in their beds thousands of miles away. They knew her schedule, her dreams, and the exact cost of her family's lives. They presented the contract, a triple union. If she signed, the debt was erased, and her family would be under the permanent protection of the Park Empire. If she refused, the feed would turn red before the hour was up. Looking into the three identical faces of her future, Ifoma realized the soft life she knew was over. To save the people she loved, she would have to learn to survive the three men who now owned her. Before we find out if Ifoma can survive the next 60 minutes, we want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. We read every single one of them. And if you're ready to see how this dark union unfolds, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this story. Don't forget to leave a comment below. It's the best way to support the channel. The air in Ifoma's small apartment, usually scented with the faint, comforting aroma of dried hibiscus and old textbooks, had suddenly turned cold and metallic. It was as if the three men had brought their own atmosphere with them, a pressurized, high-altitude chill that made her lungs feel tight. They didn't just occupy the room, they annexed it. Ji-hoon, the one who had spoken with such devastating clarity, moved toward her bookshelf. His fingers, adorned with a heavy signet ring and a watch that likely cost more than her entire education, traced the spines of her novels with a slow, predatory appreciation. He was the anchor of the trio, his posture rigid and commanding. Every time his dark eyes flicked toward her, Ifoma felt a physical weight press against her chest, a silent demand for a deference she didn't know how to give. To his left, Ji-won leaned against her small dining table. He was the mirror image of his brother, yet his energy was dangerously different. While Ji-hoon was a storm, Ji-won was the calm eye of it, smiling with a polished, magnetic charm that felt like a velvet glove hiding a blade. He watched her face, tracking the rapid pulse in her throat. His expression one of intellectual curiosity, as if he were solving a particularly beautiful puzzle. "Your apartment is charming, Ifoma," Ji-won said, his voice a smooth, melodic contrast to the tension. Small, fragile, much like the life you've built here. It's a pity to see it all hanging by such a thin thread. Ifoma backed away until her hips hit the kitchen counter. The third triplet, Chisok, hadn't moved from the door. He stood with his arms crossed over his broad chest, a silent, brooding sentry. His hair was slightly more tousled than his brother's, and his gaze was unreadable, shadowed by a quiet menace that made him seem like the most volatile of the three. He didn't look at her books or her furniture. He looked only at her, his eyes never wavering from her face. The visual of the three of them, identical, impeccably tailored, and overwhelmingly masculine, created a suffocating perimeter. They were a unified front of black silk and charcoal wool, a triple shadow that blocked out the rest of the world. Every exit was covered, every hope of escape muffled by their sheer physical presence. "My father's debt has nothing to do with me," Ifoma whispered, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain regal. She wrapped her silk robe tighter around her curves, trying to reclaim some sense of sanctuary, but the triplets didn't blink. Jihoon stopped his pacing and turned to face her fully. The light from her overhead lamp caught the sharp, refined planes of his jawline. "In our world, Ifoma, blood is the only currency that never devalues. Your father understood that when he signed the contract. He didn't just bet his business, he bet his legacy." He stepped into her personal space, the scent of expensive sandalwood and crisp linen enveloping her. He was tall, his frame casting a long shadow that swallowed her own. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gesture toward the tablet Jiwon still held, the screen still glowing with the live feed of her family in Lagos. "Look at them," Jihoon commanded softly. "They are sleeping soundly because they believe they are safe. You are the only thing standing between that sleep and a nightmare they will never wake from." Ifoma looked, her vision blurring with unshed tears. The contrast was agonizing. The soft, innocent faces of her sisters on the screen versus the three predatory, elite men standing in her kitchen. The triplets versus one dynamic was not a negotiation. It was an eclipse. She was a single point of light, being surrounded by three distinct, dark forces that moved with a terrifying, synchronized purpose. Jisuk finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. 48 minutes, Jihoon." The reminder of the clock cut through the room like a physical blade. The triplets didn't need to shout or use force. Their mere existence in her sanctuary was an act of violence against her freedom. They were a wall of fair skin, sharp jawlines, and disciplined power, waiting for her to realize that her old life had already been erased the moment they crossed her threshold. Ifoma looked from one identical face to the next. The cold dominance of Jihoon, the strategic charm of Jiwon, and the unreadable mystery of Jisuk. They weren't just men. They were a collective destiny. And as the silence stretched, heavy and expectant, Ifoma felt the first true crack in her resolve. She was no longer a student or a daughter. She was a woman standing in the center of a triple shadow, watching her world disappear. Ifoma's fingers gripped the edge of the laminate countertop so hard, her knuckles turned a ghostly shade of gray. Her mind, usually so sharp and disciplined, raced through every legal textbook and lecture she had ever mastered. She was a student of international law. There had to be a jurisdictional shield, a breach of contract clause, or a police precinct close enough to intervene before the clock struck 0. "My father's signatures are often contested," she said, her voice gaining a desperate, brittle edge. "He's been under medical duress for years. Any court in this country would stay in enforcement of a debt involving a third-party marriage. You can't just walk into a sovereign home and claim a human being as collateral. Jiwon let out a soft, melodic huff of amusement that chilled her more than Jihoon's silence. He straightened from the table and stepped toward her, his movements fluid and unnervingly graceful. You're thinking like a student, Ifoma. You're thinking about courts and judges who take months to deliberate while wearing powdered wigs. He held up the tablet again, the high-definition feed of her mother's house in Lagos, so clear she could see the flickering moth near the porch light. Our jurisdiction doesn't recognize borders. We aren't here to litigate. We are here to collect. I have friends at the embassy, she countered, her breath hitching. If I don't check in, they'll notice. People will look for me. Jisuk, still anchored by the door, finally uncrossed his arms. His presence was like a physical weight in the small kitchen. Your friends at the embassy are currently enjoying a very generous donation to their re-election funds, courtesy of our family's shipping interests, he said, his voice a low, unhurried rasp. And the local police in Lagos? They've already been told there's a gas leak on your mother's street. They've cleared the area. No one is coming, Ifeoma. Not here, and certainly not there. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Their reach wasn't just local. It was a global web, woven with the kind of wealth that silenced sirens and turned embassies into glass houses. She looked at Jihoon, the most dominant of the three, searching for a flicker of mercy in those dark, intense eyes. He was watching her with a possessive focus that made her feel already claimed, as if she were a piece of fine art he had already purchased and was simply waiting for the delivery. 30 minutes, Jihoon stated. He didn't raise his voice, yet it filled the room, vibrating in her very marrow. Every second you spend looking for a loophole is a second you steal from your mother's safety. Is your pride worth more than their lives? Ifoma looked back at the screen. She saw her mother shift in her sleep, her face peaceful, unaware that 3 shadows were standing over her daughter, half a world away, deciding her fate. Ifoma thought of her younger sister's laughter, the dreams they had of university, and the soft, regal life she wanted for them. If she refused, that peace would be shattered by the sound of breaking glass and gunfire. The silence in the apartment became deafening, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the stove clock. The triplets stood like statues of dark marble, a united front of disciplined masculinity. They didn't need to touch her to make her feel the bars of the cage. The triple shadow was closing in, and the air was running out. If I sign, she began, her voice cracking, you give me your word. My mother, my sisters, they are never touched. They are taken care of, forever. They will be the most protected women in West Africa, Jiwon promised, his tone suddenly gentle, almost seductive. Their debts cleared, their futures funded. You aren't just saving them, Ifoma. You are elevating them. Ifoma looked at the contract on the table. The words, triple union, stared back at her. A phrase that promised a life she couldn't even begin to imagine, shared by 3 men who looked like gods and acted like monsters. She picked up the sleek, heavy pen Jihoon offered. Her hand shook, but as she thought of her mother's smile, her resolve hardened into a cold, sacrificial stone. She pressed the nib to the paper, the ink flowing smoothly, sealing her fate. As she finished the last stroke of her name, she felt the invisible tether to her old life snap. It's done, she whispered, dropping the pen. It clattered against the table, a tiny sound that signaled the end of her world. Jihoon stepped forward, his hand finally closing over her shoulder. His grip was firm, warm, and terrifyingly permanent. "A wise choice, Ifoma," he murmured, his gaze sweeping over her beautiful, tear-streaked face. "Tonight, you leave this small life behind. Tonight, you belong to us." The transition from her cramped, familiar apartment to the park penthouse happened in a blur of tinted glass and silent engines. Ifoma sat in the back of a luxury SUV, flanked by Jihoon and Jiwon, while Jisuk sat in the front, his watchful eyes reflected in the rearview mirror. When the vehicle finally pulled into a private underground garage and an elevator whisked them directly into the sky, the sheer scale of her new reality hit her. The penthouse was a sprawling cathedral of glass, marble, and shadow, perched so high above the city that the streetlights below looked like fallen glitter. "This is your home now," Jihoon said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, open-plan living area. He didn't suggest it. He decreed it. Before she could process the cold beauty of the space, she was whisked away by a silent, efficient staff who seemed to materialize from the shadows. She was led to a master suite that was larger than her entire apartment. The centerpiece was a sunken marble tub, already steaming with water, scented with oud and rose. The ritual that followed felt less like a bath and more like a baptism into a different life. Under the watchful but professional eyes of the attendants, the dust of her old world was washed away. Her skin, deep and rich like mahogany, glowed under the soft recessed lighting as she was exfoliated and oiled until she shimmered. When she emerged from the steam, a garment was waiting for her on the velvet chaise lounge. It was a floor-length robe of heavy, liquid silk in a deep champagne hue that perfectly complemented her warm undertones. As she slid it on, the fabric clung to her curves, the belt cinching her small waist and emphasizing the elegant fullness of her hips. She looked in the floor-to-ceiling mirror and hardly recognized the woman staring back. She looked regal, expensive, and utterly trapped. A soft knock preceded the entrance of the triplets. They had changed out of their travel suits into relaxed, yet equally high-end lounge attire. Dark silk shirts, unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the sharp lines of their collarbones. They moved into the room with a synchronized grace that made the air feel heavy. Jiwon stepped forward first, his eyes raking over her with an appreciative, strategic glint. He reached out, his fingers grazing the silk of her sleeve. "You wear our colors well, Ifoma. It's a vast improvement over the cotton rags you were wearing in that hovel." Ifoma pulled back slightly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "How long am I to stay in this room?" "The room? As long as you like," Jisuk said from the doorway, his voice a low, mysterious rumble. "But the penthouse? That is your world now. You have everything you could ever desire here. Libraries, gyms, a chef who knows every spice of your homeland. And if I want to go for a walk? To finish my degree?" Ifoma asked, her voice trembling. Jihoon stepped into her personal space, his dominant presence forcing her to look up. He caught her chin between his thumb and forefinger, his grip firm but not bruising. The heat from his hand seeped into her skin. "You are no longer a private citizen, Ifoma. You are the park bride. Out there, you are a target. In here, you are ours." "You will never leave these premises," Jiwon added, his voice dropping to a seductive, dangerous whisper as he moved to her other side. "Unless all three of us are with you. You move when we move. You breathe when we allow it. Your safety is our primary concern, but your presence is our primary requirement." Ifoma looked from one identical face to the next. The gilded fortress was not just the walls of the penthouse, it was the three men surrounding her. They were the bars of her cage. 3 identical pillars of iron wrapped in silk. She realized then that her signature on that contract hadn't just bought her family's safety. It had sold her autonomy to a trinity that intended to share every second of her existence. "Tonight, you rest," Ji-hoon murmured, his thumb brushing over her full lower lip. "Tomorrow, you begin to learn the rules of being ours." As they turned to leave, the heavy double doors clicking shut with a finality that sounded like a vault closing, Ifoma sank onto the edge of the massive bed. The silk of her robe felt like a second skin, a beautiful, expensive uniform for a life that was no longer her own. She was high above the world, safe and pampered, yet she had never felt more like a prisoner. The first morning in the penthouse didn't bring the clarity Ifoma hoped for. Instead, it brought the realization that her life was now a choreographed dance between 3 distinct masters. The territory of her new existence was carved up before the sun had fully cleared the skyline, each triplet claiming a different part of her mind and body with calculated precision. Ji-hoon was the first to establish his dominance. He met her in the expansive, minimalist dining wing, where the floor-to-ceiling glass made her feel as though she were floating in a void of blue sky. He didn't offer a morning greeting. Instead, he sat at the head of the obsidian table, his dark silk shirt buttoned to the throat, radiating a cold, disciplined energy. When she moved to sit, he held up a single, manicured hand. "In this house, Ifoma, there is a hierarchy," he said, his voice a low-level strike of flint. "You do not sit until I am seated. You do not leave the table until I dismissed you. My brothers may indulge your spirit, but I am the one who ensures you remain alive to have one. My protection is absolute, and in exchange, I demand a respect that is absolute." He stood and walked toward her, his tall frame blocking out the morning sun. He didn't touch her, but he leaned in close enough for her to feel the controlled heat of his presence. "Do you understand?" Ifoma swallowed hard, her pulse drumming against the collar of her champagne robe. "I understand, Ji-hoon." "Good." The ghost of a smirk touched his sharp jawline before he turned away, leaving her breathless and shaken by the sheer weight of his authority. If Ji-hoon was the iron fist, Ji-won was the velvet glove. He found her later in the library, a circular room filled with thousands of leather-bound volumes that smelled of ancient paper and wealth. He was sprawled in a mid-century modern chair, a book of Nigerian history resting on his lap. He looked up and smiled, a warm, magnetic expression that felt like a trap designed to make her forget the guards at the door. "Ji-hoon can be exhausting," Ji-won murmured, gesturing for her to join him. "He sees the world as a series of tactical maneuvers. I prefer to see it as a narrative. Tell me about your studies, Ifoma. Tell me about the laws you were so eager to cite last night." For an hour, he engaged her in a way no one else had. He listened with an intensity that made her feel like the most important person in the world, his sharp intelligence matching her own as they debated the nuances of international trade. It was a seductive kind of danger. He wasn't demanding her obedience. He was colonizing her mind, making her crave the intellectual stimulation he offered. For a moment, she almost forgot she was a prisoner, until he reached out and tucked a stray lock of her black hair behind her ear, his touch lingering just a second too long. "You are a brilliant woman," he whispered, his expressive eyes searching hers. "It would be a waste to keep that mind in a cage. Let me be the one who opens it for you." Throughout it all, there was Chisok. He was the ghost in the machine, the constant, unreadable presence that Ifoma felt more than she saw. While Ji-hoon commanded and Ji-won seduced, Chisok simply watched. She would catch a glimpse of him in the reflection of a mirror, standing in a shadowed doorway, or leaning against a far wall with his arms crossed over his broad chest. His silence was a physical pressure, a brooding mystery that she couldn't solve. When she retreated to the terrace in the late afternoon, she found him there, staring out at the city with a glass of dark liquid in his hand. He didn't speak as she approached, his expression carrying a quiet menace that made her skin prickle. Yet, when a sudden gust of wind caught her robe, he stepped between her and the railing, his large frame acting as a human shield. He didn't look at her, but his hand moved to the small of her back, a brief, grounding contact that felt unexpectedly safe. "They want to own you in different ways," Chisuk said, his voice a deep, unhurried rasp that broke his long silence. "Jihoon wants your soul. Jiwon wants your mind." Ifoma looked up at his unreadable face. "And what do you want, Chisuk?" He finally turned his gaze toward her, his dark eyes carrying a depth of emotion that terrified her. "I want to be the one you run to when they finally break you." He walked away without another word, leaving Ifoma standing in the fading light, caught in a confusing web of fear and burgeoning attraction. She was being pulled in 3 directions by 3 identical men, each offering a different version of a life she had never asked for, yet was starting to realize she could no longer escape. The silence of the penthouse at 3 a.m. was thick and artificial, a pressurized stillness that Ifoma had begun to associate with her new life. She lay awake in the expansive master's suite, the silk sheets cool against her skin, watching the rhythmic sweep of the city's lights across the ceiling. She was a captive of luxury, adjusting to the terrifyingly precise rotation of the Park brothers, when the silence didn't just break, it shattered. The sound was a dull metallic thud, followed by the sharp, pressurized hiss of a breached seal. It came from the direction of the private terrace. Ifoma sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Before she could even reach for her robe, her bedroom door was thrown open. It was Chisuk. He didn't look like the brooding, silent sentry she had spent the afternoon with. He was a shadow in motion, dressed in dark, tactical trousers and a fitted black shirt that clung to his muscular frame. In his hand was a suppressed handgun, held with a terrifying, casual familiarity. He didn't speak. He simply reached out, his large hand wrapping around her forearm with a grounding, urgent strength, and pulled her toward the recessed walk-in closet that doubled as a reinforced panic room. "Stay low. Do not move until I come for you," he whispered, his voice a low, lethal vibration that raised the hair on her arms. Through the crack of the door, Ifoma watched the triple shadow transform from masters of a penthouse into masters of war. From the hallway, Jihoon appeared, his expression carved from the coldest stone. He moved with a synchronized, predatory grace that made her realize his demand for respect wasn't just ego. It was the byproduct of a man who lived on the edge of a blade. A shadow moved across the frosted glass of the living area. An intruder, masked and lean, clutching a serrated knife. He never had a chance to use it. Jiwon, usually the architect of conversation and charm, moved with a terrifying, silent speed. He intercepted the man in the center of the marble floor. There was no dialogue, no warning. Ifoma watched, breathless, as Jiwon's strategic intelligence turned into physical violence. With a sharp, disciplined strike, he disarmed the intruder, the metallic clatter of the knife echoing through the vast space. Then Jihoon stepped into the light. The cold dominance she had seen at the dinner table was now a focused, lethal intent. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the intruder by the throat. his tall frame towering over the man, his eyes flashing with a possessive fury that terrified Ifoma more than the intruder ever had. "You entered a home that belongs to the Park family," Ji-hoon said, his voice a level, deadly baritone. "You stepped into the space where we keep what is ours." The violence was brief, professional, and absolute. The triplets moved as a single organism, a trinity of iron and silk that neutralized the threat before it could even utter a sound. Chisok remained positioned between the violence and Ifeoma's door, his watchful eyes never leaving the perimeter, acting as the final, unbreakable barrier between her and the world that wanted to hurt her. Once the intruder was dragged away by silent, dark-clad security teams that appeared from the service elevators, the pressure in the room shifted. The triplets converged near her door. Their breathing was barely elevated, their expensive clothes barely ruffled, but the air around them hummed with a raw, protective energy. Ji-won was the first to enter the room. He reached out, his fingers brushing the hair back from her forehead, his touch uncharacteristically steady. "He's gone, Ifoma. You're safe." "Who was he?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "A ghost from a past that doesn't matter anymore," Ji-hoon said, stepping into the room. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her small, huddled form. For the first time, the dominance in his eyes wasn't a demand for obedience. It was a promise of safety. "We told you that outside these walls, you are a target. Inside, you are under the protection of the Park name. Tonight, you saw why." Ifoma looked at the three of them, the cold commander, the lethal strategist, and the silent protector. The gilded fortress had changed. The bars of the cage hadn't disappeared, but for the first time, she saw them as a shield. She looked at the blood on Ji-hoon's cuff and the steady, watchful gaze of Ji-suk, and felt a confusing, visceral shift in her soul. She was still their prisoner, but as the adrenaline faded and the silent penthouse reclaimed its stillness, she realized she was something else, too. She was the only thing in the world they were all willing to kill for. The fear was still there, but beneath it, a new, dangerous sense of belonging began to take root. For the first time since the midnight knock, Ifoma didn't feel like a victim. She felt protected. The adrenaline from the breach didn't fade into the usual numbness of captivity. It curdled into a cold, hard resolve. Ifoma spent the morning watching the sunrise bleed across the Atlantic from the penthouse balcony, her reflection in the glass looking back at her with eyes that had seen too much. The silk of her robe felt too thin, her soft presence too vulnerable. If the world was going to come for her because of the men who owned her, she refused to be the fragile thing they tucked away in a panic room. She found Ji-won in his private study, a room of glass and digital maps that looked like the nerve center of a global shadow empire. He was mid-call, his voice a lethal whisper of logistics and leverage, but he paused the moment he saw her. He didn't offer a charming smile this time. His gaze was analytical, tracing the new, rigid set of her shoulders. "I can't just sit in the library and read about the past while the present tries to kill me," Ifoma said, her voice steadying as she crossed the room to stand before his desk. "You said you didn't want to keep my mind in a cage. Prove it. Teach me the business. Teach me how you move money, how you find people, and how you see the threats before they reach the door." Ji-won leaned back, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his refined features before it was replaced by a dark, appreciative glint. "You want to see the gears of the machine, Ifoma? Most people go their whole lives trying to look away from the blood on the ledger." "I'm not most people," she countered, her almond-shaped eyes narrowing. "And I'm tired of being the only one in this room who doesn't know the rules of the game we're playing." Jiwon gestured to the chair across from him, his expression shifting from seducer to mentor. Then sit. Let's talk about the difference between power and influence. For hours, he stripped away the mystery of the Park Empire. He showed her how they used legitimate shipping lanes to mask the movement of high-value assets, and how digital currency could disappear into the ether. It was a cold, mathematical world. But as Ifoma absorbed the data, she felt the first flicker of agency. Knowledge was a different kind of armor, and she wore it with a grim satisfaction. But knowledge wasn't enough to stop a knife. In the late afternoon, she sought out Jisuk. He was in the private training gym, his black shirt discarded, his muscular back a roadmap of old scars and tension as he hammered a heavy bag with rhythmic, bone-jarring strikes. He didn't stop when she entered, the thud of his fists against the leather echoing in the sterile space. "I want to know how to use it," she said, nodding toward the sleek, suppressed handgun resting on the bench nearby. Jisuk stopped mid-swing, his chest heaving, sweat glistening against his fair, warm-toned skin. He turned his unreadable, dark gaze toward her, the silence stretching between them until the air felt heavy. "Jihoon won't like it. He wants you untouched." "Jihoon wants a doll. You saw what happened last night." Ifoma stepped closer, her soft, regal beauty contrasting sharply with the harsh reality of the gym. "I won't be the reason one of you dies because I was too afraid to pull a trigger." Jisuk walked toward her, his presence a physical pressure that forced her to stand her ground. He picked up the weapon, cleared the chamber with a sharp, disciplined metallic click, and held it out to her, grip first. "It's heavy. It's loud. And once you use it, you can never go back to being the girl who lived in that quiet apartment." "That girl died the night you knocked on her door," she said, her voice dropping to a low, fierce rasp. He stood behind her, his large, warm hands wrapping over hers as he guided her grip. The intimacy was jarring, the heat of his chest against her back, the scent of salt and sandalwood, and the cold weight of the steel in her palm. He taught her how to stand, how to breathe, and how to look past the target. For the first time, the triple shadow wasn't just surrounding her, it was arming her. As she squeezed the trigger for the first time, the recoil jarring her bones, Ifoma felt a terrifying rush of adrenaline. She wasn't just a prisoner in a gilded fortress anymore. She was a student of their darkness. She looked at the hole in the center of the target, and then up at Jisuk, whose unreadable expression held a new, dangerous spark of respect. She was starting to learn the game. And, for the first time, she wasn't just a piece on the board. She was a player. The scent of expensive oud and polished marble was incinerated in a heartbeat, replaced by the choking, chemical roar of accelerant. The explosion didn't just rattle the glass of the penthouse, it turned the floor-to-ceiling windows into a rain of crystalline shrapnel. Ifoma was thrown from her chair in the library, the world tilting into a chaotic blur of orange heat and black smoke. Before she could scream, a heavy, charcoal-colored suit jacket was draped over her head, and she was hauled upward by a pair of arms that felt like iron bands. "Move! Down the service spine! Now!" Jihoon's voice was a jagged blade cutting through the roar of the fire. He didn't look like a billionaire heir anymore. He looked like a god of war, his face smudged with soot, his eyes narrowed into lethal slits. They moved as a blurred, high-speed phalanx. Jisuk led the way, a suppressed submachine gun held low and ready, clearing the smoke-filled corridor with a terrifying, silent efficiency. Jiwon was at Ifeoma's other side, his usual charm replaced by a frantic, strategic focus as he tapped commands into a scorched handheld device, calling in the extraction team. They didn't take the main elevator. Instead, they plunged into a hidden, reinforced concrete stairwell that spiraled into the bowels of the building. The underground garage was a screech of tires and the smell of burning rubber. They piled into a matte black armored sedan just as a second explosion rocked the foundation above them. Chisop took the wheel, the engine roaring to life with a predatory growl. Kande isn't just sending a message anymore, Jiwon muttered, his fingers flying over a screen as he tracked the heat signatures of the pursuing vehicles. He's trying to erase the bloodline. The chase through the city was a fever dream of high-speed maneuvers and the rhythmic thud-thud of bullets flattening against reinforced steel. Ifoma sat in the back, squeezed between Jihoon and Jiwon, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The proximity was overwhelming. The heat from their bodies, the scent of gunpowder and sweat, and the sheer, vibrating intensity of their collective will to keep her breathing. In the chaos, the triple shadow had become her only reality. They broke the city limits, the neon lights fading into the oppressive darkness of the Virginia countryside. For 3 hours, Chisok pushed the car through winding back roads until they reached a secluded estate hidden deep within a forest of ancient oaks. The safe house was a low-slung fortress of stone and timber designed to disappear into the landscape. Inside, the adrenaline finally began to ebb, leaving behind a raw, jagged exhaustion. The house was smaller than the penthouse, the ceilings lower, the rooms more intimate. There was nowhere to hide, no silent staff to act as a buffer. Ifoma stood in the center of the wood-beamed living room, her silk robe torn and stained with soot, her skin glowing with a feverish intensity. She looked at the 3 men who had just dragged her through hell. They were disheveled, their expensive shirts ruined, their fair skin bruised and bloodied. For the first time, the gilded fortress was gone, replaced by a cabin in the woods where they were just 4 people hunted by a common enemy. "You're shaking," Chisok said, his voice a low, unhurried rasp. He stepped toward her, his large hands reaching out. This time, Ifoma didn't pull back. She didn't seek a loophole or a legal defense. She stepped into his space, her forehead resting against his chest. The final emotional walls didn't fall with a crash. They simply dissolved. Jihoon moved to her other side, his hand resting on the nape of her neck, his thumb brushing over her pulse point with a grounding, possessive tenderness. Jiwon stood before her, his expressive eyes searching hers, the strategic mask finally discarded to reveal a raw, desperate need to ensure she was whole. "We almost lost you tonight," Jihoon whispered, his voice cracking for the first time. And in that second, I realized that the debt didn't matter. The contract didn't matter. Only you did. The proximity in the small room was suffocating, but not with fear. It was a dense, multifaceted heat. Ifoma looked at the 3 identical faces, seeing the distinct souls behind the masks. She saw the burden of Jihoon's leadership, the weight of Jiwon's intellect, and the depth of Jisok's silence. She reached out, her fingers grazing Jiwon's jaw, her other hand gripping Jisok's arm. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice a low, fierce promise. In the silence of the Virginia woods, the coercion finally bled into something else, a dark, bonded devotion. They were no longer masters and a prisoner. They were a unit, forged in fire and sealed in the shadows of a safe house. The world outside wanted them dead, but inside those stone walls, Ifoma realized she had stopped looking for the exit. She was exactly where she belonged. The secluded Virginia estate was a symphony of old wood and quiet secrets. But the silence that morning felt heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Ifoma moved through the sun-drenched library, her mind still humming with the tactical data Chi-Wan had taught her. She wasn't looking for a betrayal. She was looking for a ledger to balance the estate's security costs. Instead, tucked behind a false panel in a heavy mahogany desk, she found a thin vellum folder marked with a seal she had learned to recognize as Kang Dae's. Her breath hitched as she pulled out the documents. They weren't just records, they were a blueprint of a lie. There were forged bank statements from her father's business, fabricated gambling markers, and a series of intercepted communications. The debt that had shattered her life, the ultimatum that had brought the triplets to her door at midnight, was a phantom. A ghost created by a rival to manipulate the Parks into taking her. But as her eyes scanned the margins, her blood turned to ice. There were notations in Ji-won's elegant, precise script. They had known. For 3 weeks, while she had been learning their names, their bodies, and their world, they had known the debt was a fiction. And they had kept her anyway. The door to the study creaked open. The triplets entered as a single, unified force, their fair skin glowing in the morning light, their tailored shirts pristine once more. They saw the folder in her hand, and for the first time since the fire, the triple shadow looked fractured. "Ifoma," Ji-won began, his voice a smooth, strategic caress that now sounded like the hiss of a predator. "We were going to tell you. The timing—" "The timing?" Ifoma's voice was a low, vibrating rasp of heartbreak. She stood, the paper trembling in her mahogany-toned hand. "You let me believe my mother's life was on a countdown. You let me sign away my soul to save a family that was never in danger from anyone but you." Ji-hoon stepped forward, his dominant presence attempting to close the gap. But she recoiled as if his touch were acid. "The threat from Kang Dae was real, Ifoma," he said, his baritone level and cold. "If we hadn't taken you, he would have used that fake debt to take you himself. We chose the only way to ensure you were under our protection." "Protection?" she spat, a tear finally escaping and tracking down her striking cheekbone. "Is that what you call this? You didn't protect me. You purchased me with a lie. You didn't want a partner. You wanted a possession that was grateful for its cage." She looked at Ji-seok, the silent one she had begun to trust, but even his brooding gaze was shadowed with guilt. The realization was a physical blow to her chest. They hadn't kept her out of necessity, but out of a dark, obsessive need for control. They loved the power they held over her more than they loved her. The devotion she had started to feel was a house built on sand, and the tide had just come in. "You knew for weeks," she whispered, her voice breaking. "While I was learning to shoot, while I was sitting at your table, while I was starting to love you. You watched me struggle with the guilt of sacrificing myself, and you said nothing. You just watched." "Ifoma, listen to me." Ji-won reached out, his magnetic eyes desperate. "The feeling is real. The lie was the start, but the love is the truth. There is no truth in a cage built on a ghost debt," she countered, her regal posture returning as a shield of pure ice. She dropped the folder, the papers scattering across the floor like dead leaves. "You told me I could never leave without all 3 of you. You told me I was a target out there." She walked toward the door, her silk robe billowing around her curves, her expression one of cold, unforgettable, refined fury. As she reached the threshold, she turned back to the 3 identical men who had become her entire world. "I would rather be a target in the real world than a doll in this one," she said, her voice a final, echoing decree. Do not follow me. Do not look for me. If I see any of you again, I will use the skills you were so eager to teach me. The contract is dead. And so are we. She walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the long, silent hallway of the estate. The triplets stood paralyzed in the center of their shattered lie, watching the only thing that had ever mattered to them walk into the light, leaving them alone in the shadows they had created. The silence Ifoma left in her wake lasted only until the perimeter sensors shrieked a final, desperate warning. Kande hadn't just come for a debt. He had come to salt the earth. The Virginia estate exploded into a symphony of shattering glass and tactical gunfire as a convoy of dark SUVs breached the tree line. Ifoma, halfway to the garage, felt the shockwave of a grenade rattle her bones. She looked toward the driveway, toward the freedom she'd just demanded, and then back at the house, where the three men she supposedly hated were stepping into a hail of lead to buy her time to vanish. The Queen's choice was made in the heartbeat between fear and fury. She didn't run for the car. She ran back into the smoke. She found Jisok pinned behind a stone pillar in the foyer, his shoulder blooming with crimson, his ammunition running low. He looked at her, his unreadable eyes widening with a mix of horror and a sudden fierce hope. Ifoma didn't say a word. She grabbed the spare tactical kit he had dropped, her hands steady as she cleared a jam in the weapon he had taught her to use. On the upper landing, Ji-hoon was a silhouette of cold, lethal precision, and Ji-won was orchestrating their defense with a jagged, desperate brilliance. Ifoma didn't play the victim. She moved with the triple shadow, using the angles Ji-won had taught her and the breathing Jisok had drilled into her marrow. When Kangdae himself breached the heavy oak doors, his face twisted in a sneer of triumph. It wasn't a park bullet that stopped him. It was Ifoma. She stood in the center of the wreckage, her regal beauty smeared with soot and blood, her gaze unwavering as she pulled the trigger. The man who had engineered her misery fell, and with him, the ghost of the debt finally died. As the dust settled and the sirens of their private security detail finally neared, the silence that returned to the estate was different. It was heavy with the weight of things that couldn't be unsaid. The triplets stood before her, their fair skin pale, their expensive clothes in tatters. They looked at her not as a possession, but as a force they no longer knew how to contain. "The jet is fueled," Ji-hoon said, his voice a raw, hollow baritone. He didn't look at her with dominance. He looked at her with a devastating, quiet respect. "The divorce papers are in the safe. Your mother and sisters are already being moved to a villa in Marbella. You are free, Ifoma. Truly free. We lied to keep you, and for that, we have no right to ask you to stay." Ji-won stepped forward, his eyes shimmering with a rare, uncalculated honesty. "We fell in love with a woman we thought we could control. We ended up being conquered by a queen we don't deserve. Go home, Ifoma." Ifoma looked at the three identical faces, the men who had been her captors, her teachers, and finally, her partners in blood. She looked at the flight coordinates Ji-won held out, and then at the ruins of the house they had defended together. She realized that the girl from the quiet apartment was gone, but the woman who remained didn't want a life of small safety. She wanted the throne. "I'm not going back to that apartment," she said, her voice a soft, unforgettable decree that echoed through the charred hallway. She walked toward them, stepping into the center of their circle, her presence more commanding than all three of them combined. "But if I stay, the rules change. No more lies. No more cages. The park empire becomes legitimate. No more blood on the ledger my children will inherit. I am not your bride by contract. I am your queen by choice. Do you accept my terms? Jihoon, Jiwon, and Jisuk bowed their heads in a synchronized, disciplined act of total submission. Always, they whispered in a unified vow. Years later, the Gilded Fortress was no longer a prison, but a legacy. The Park Corporation had become a global titan of ethical shipping and fine art, its headquarters a beacon of legitimate power. In the sprawling gardens of the rebuilt Virginia estate, the air was no longer filled with the scent of gunpowder, but the bright, chaotic laughter of children. 3 identical boys and 2 girls with deep, rich brown skin and their mothers' striking almond eyes chased each other through the manicured hedges. Ifoma stood on the terrace, a vision of expensive, polished grace in a flowing silk gown, watching her family. She felt the presence of the triplets behind her before they even spoke. 3 identical shadows that no longer loomed over her, but stood firmly at her back. She had been their virgin bride, their captive, and their secret. Now, she was the foundation of everything they were. 4 moral lessons from the story. 1. Truth is the only lasting foundation. The ghost debt served as a turning point in the narrative, proving that a relationship built on manipulation is inherently fragile. While the triplets used a lie to protect Ifoma, that lack of transparency nearly destroyed the very bond they sought to create. The lesson is that genuine loyalty cannot be manufactured through deception. It must be earned through radical honesty, even when the truth is dangerous. 2. Mercy is a higher power than control. At the start of the story, the triplets equated power with total dominance, controlling Ifoma's movements, her clothes, and her environment. However, they only achieved true victory when they surrendered that control and offered her the choice to leave. By choosing mercy and autonomy over possession, they allowed a much stronger force to take root: willing devotion, which is far more powerful than forced compliance. 3. Adversity reveals the true self. Ifoma began as a reactive character, someone who felt she had no choice but to submit. It was only through the first breach and the fire at the penthouse that her true nature, that of a queen and a protector, was revealed. The story teaches that crisis does not just test us. It uncovers the strength we didn't know we possessed. Ifoma didn't just survive the triplets' world, she mastered it. 4. Choice is the ultimate agency. The story concludes not with a contract, but with a queen's choice. Ifoma's decision to stay on her own terms redefined the dynamic from one of captivity to one of partnership. This highlights the moral that true freedom isn't just the absence of bars, but the power to define the terms of your own life. By turning her cage into a throne, Ifoma proved that agency is something you claim, not something you are given. A story that began with a midnight threat ended with the birth of an empire, but only because one woman was brave enough to claim her own throne. If you enjoyed this journey of power, passion, and the Park Triplets, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new chapter. Like and share this video with someone who loves a high-stakes romance, and comment below with your favorite moment from Ifoma's transformation. We'll see you in the next story.